first study. This was one that I finished last year at about this time. I defended my dissertation, and of course, the title was Doing Bad Things for Good Reasons. It was all about those cases where someone does something unethical, but it's not out of selfish interest. It's actually they believe they're helping the organization or helping their team or helping their supervisor. And it comes from this premise that, workers who identify highly with their organization are more likely, unfortunately, to do unethical things to further that organization's interests. And I would suggest that's a pretty significant problem because you can't manage that the same way that you would somebody who's just doing something selfishly, right? These might be your high performers. These might be folks who are highly identified with the organization, very committed. They're top performers on your team, and they may do something unethical, not because you asked them to, but because they think it's going to help the organization, right? So we kind of want to prevent that over identification. So the question here then is, how do we encourage workers to identify with the organization? Because we want that, right? Every organization around the world wants people to identify with the organization, feel a sense of belonging. But how do we mitigate the risk of somebody doing something unethical in our name? Okay, so we'll talk about some variables that we can influence that help prevent that kind of behavior. Really quick look at the methods for this study. So participants were professional engineers. And I do want to acknowledge, as someone who was truly, still to an extent an outsider as a non-engineer today, but I was really an outsider when I started doing this study, just navigating some of the networks and trying to figure out how do I connect with professional engineers and convince them to dedicate some time to filling out a survey. So felt very fortunate, had some great support within ASCE and NSPE as well. And some leaders that really just helped build that network and encourage people to participate. So I feel very fortunate for that. There were 281 participants in the study. It was, of course, voluntary. It was confidential. In fact, even if I was a super curious researcher and wanted to see, well, who responded this way? No way to do that, right? It's actually very, very well controlled. And then participants could withdraw at any time, which is not unheard of in an ethics survey like this. You might encounter a question that just, causes you to pause and maybe you don't want to think about it at that time, or you just don't want to deal with an ethical question. So certainly there's folks that don't get all the way through the survey, and that's fine. The procedure there, so I refer to some different scales. So when we're talking about a scale, we mean basically a list of items, a list of questions or prompts that someone is completing when they complete that survey. So you get a sense from that list of what variables we're trying to measure. And then, of course, the results are analyzed. And this is where in a quantitative study like this, you're really testing hypotheses. You're trying to say, I've got this variable, and I want to see, is there a relationship between the two of them that's statistically significant? And how strong is that relationship? And in what direction is that relationship? Is it positive or is it negative? Okay. So a little background on how the study was conducted. Now, I'll share the results with you, but I want to clarify a few terms just so they're familiar and we can kind of get comfortable navigating those. The first one is moral disengagement, which I think is super interesting. It's probably worth a presentation all in its own. But it's this notion that we distance ourselves from our moral standards at some point in time. Usually when we're facing stress or we're facing a very difficult ethical dilemma, there's times where we may make excuses for ourselves to kind of distance ourselves from those closely held moral standards. One way that we do that, because you'll notice on the slide, there's 8 mechanisms. There's a lot of different ways that we do that. One way is through euphemistic language. So if I'm an engineer and I lie to the client in some way, I'm probably not going to say to myself or to a team member, I told a lie to the client, right? That's a very explicit, direct way, and frankly, an accurate way to describe that behavior and the ethical implications of it. But I might say something like, I was pretty selective about what I shared with the client, right? So just that little bit of euphemistic language, that little bit of a vague description of what was done can inform your decision making and can sort of begin to justify, that decision to mislead or lie to a client. There's other mechanisms for how that works. Sometimes just minimizing the harm, right? Or reducing the harm, justifying our behavior. And I should clarify, we all morally disengage. This is a human thing. We all do it to some extent, and we need to be aware of it. right? We need to find ways to work through it. So that's moral disengagement, which came up in the results. Moral identity is really the sense of being a moral person. If that's important to you, if it's important to you that other people perceive you that way, that you really live your moral standards, that's a strong sense of moral identity. I should clarify, having a strong sense of moral identity doesn't magically make you a good person, right? There's some folks that really think they're a good person and they're not, in practice. But we have found through research that that sense of self, that moral identity, is important. It's an important predictor of ethical behavior. And then work engagement. So you've got a description there, kind of an academic definition. I would say if you are engaged at work, you are passionate about what you do. You are excited about it. You get up ready to go to work. You're committed to overcoming obstacles. Certainly, when there's adversity, you're ready and willing to overcome that. And there's this sense of like immersion in the work where, maybe you've mastered a particular task to the extent that you just feel this sense of flow. It doesn't feel like work, and you may even, lose track of time. So when all of those experiences, those states come together, that's where we have work engagement. Okay. So just a little bit of background there so that we kind of have a sense of when we look at the results, what these concepts mean. And we'll have a moment here soon to ask some questions if we want to get a little more background information on those. So I've got on the slide here just a kind of a condensed, simplified version of the study model, just to highlight the really important nuggets of wisdom here, which if you look at each of the variables listed, you'll notice that there's arrows, and there's a plus or minus sign showing the relationship. Okay, so over here where we see a plus sign, that's showing a positive association. That means if I increase moral disengagement, there should be a corresponding increase in unethical behavior. Okay. And then, of course, it's the opposite if you've got a negative sign. So where it says moral identity, and then there's a negative sign between that and moral disengagement, that would suggest that, hey, if I increase moral identity, I'm going to decrease moral disengagement. Okay. So that should kind of already give you a sense of what we might be able to do here. If we're trying to reduce unethical behavior, we could reduce moral disengagement, try to tap into what are those thoughts or those attitudes that may justify unethical behavior and kind of try to confront that. And we can also foster a sense of moral identity, right? That will actually reduce moral disengagement. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do that to really help people process and reflect and form that sense of moral identity. Likewise, if we increase work engagement, that can reduce the extent to which folks are going to morally disengage. So at the end of the day, whatever their motivations are, whether it is pro-organizational or selfish, whatever it is, if somebody is acting unethically, there are some ways to reduce that. One is to reduce moral disengagement, to try to intervene and hopefully correct some of that thinking early on. And then, of course, within an organization, within a team, increasing moral identity and work engagement. Okay, and we can talk more in the Q&A about kind of what specific examples we might be thinking about. In terms of implications, this is the so what, right? What do we do with this information? I think one is training on moral disengagement. And that's not to say that we're not doing important things in ethics training. That's one thing that has been very impressive to me as an outsider, is seeing we have robust processes in place to train people on ethical standards, to review case studies, to really understand how do you take that written standard and apply it to your day-to-day and the ethical dilemmas that are going to come up. I think what moral disengagement adds to this is a lot of self-awareness about what do we think to ourselves as we're navigating an ethical dilemma, and what are some of those excuses that we maybe need to spend a little bit more time reflecting on. Oftentimes, these are excuses, we could say, that don't get shared with the team, right? So it's even kind of a question of, well, how do we encourage people to open up and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking about, right? So that we don't find, we're not surprised later by unethical behavior. On the same note, I would highly recommend to think about how do we coach people to correct moral disengagement. And I want to clarify, that doesn't mean that we're having a one-on-one conversation with someone and they use euphemistic language, or they kind of minimize the harm of a decision that they made. And we just attack that and say, you need to stop that. You need to stop that attitude. That's bad, right? That's moral disengagement. But creating a space in which we can ask questions, right? And help someone think through and openly share, this is kind of what I've been thinking about. This is what I'm feeling. Because if we don't work through that, right, we're not going to do away with moral disengagement, right? I suppose if in a perfect world, if you were free of moral disengagement, you probably wouldn't do anything. You probably wouldn't leave the house because you would constantly be confronted with the ethical implications of every action. So coaching to really give folks a space to talk about the ways that they morally disengage. And I'm happy afterward to share an example too of I've done some training and working with folks to coach their team members on moral disengagement that might be helpful. The third implication, there are stories of ethical followership. So the idea here is really tapping into those examples where people did the right thing when they felt pressure to do otherwise, right? When they faced an unethical request or unethical directive from a leader and they spoke up and said, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, right? Or in some other way resisted or demonstrated ethical followership. That's a pretty powerful way when we talk about that sense of moral identity and that sense of work engagement. Those stories are so important to developing that sense of being a moral person, being a good engineer, and likewise feeling engaged, feeling like I can see the ethical implications of what I do every day, right? So those stories play a pretty pivotal role. And of course, in the next study, I'll dive into a little more detail on what ethical followership looks like, right? Because it's not just the sort of ends of the continuum where we might say, well, if you're facing an unethical directive, you either comply or you quit, or you comply or you're a whistleblower, right? But what are all those behaviors in between? And how do we highlight those stories?